Good afternoon. It's story time with Uncle Bill. As read to you by charity colleague Crouse. Uncle Bill, as in Bill. How's it going? Let us begin. Page 784. On April 1st, while we were still in Senegal, Judge Wright granted my lawyer's motion for a summary judgment in the Jones case, dismissing it without a trial because she found that Jones had produced no credible evidence to support her claim. The dismissal exposed the raw political nature of Starr's investigation. Now he was pursuing me on the theory that I had given a false statement in a deposition the judge had said was not relevant, and that I had obstructed justice in a case that had no merit in the first place. No one was even talking about Whitewater anymore. Au contraire, Uncle Bill. On April 2nd, to no one's surprise, Starr said he would press on. A few days later, Bob Rubin and I announced that the United States would block the importation of 1.6 million assault weapons. Although we had banned the manufacture of 19 different assault weapons in the 1994 crime bill, ingenious foreign gun makers were trying to evade the law by making modifications on guns whose only purpose was to kill people. Really? Wow. So this story starts off with the Paula Jones case, and then assault weapons at 1.6 and 19. Nice. Early April. What do we have to look forward to next, Uncle Bill? Good Friday! April 10th was one of the happiest days of my presidency. 17 hours past the deadline for a decision, all the parties in Northern Ireland agreed to a plan to end 30 years of sectarian violence. I had been up most of the night before trying to help George Mitchell close the deal. Besides George, I talked to Bertie Ahern and to Tony Blair, David Trimble, and Jerry Adams twice before going to bed at 2:30 a.m. At 5, George woke me with a request to call Adams again to seal the deal. The agreement was a fine piece of work, calling for majority rule and minority rights, shared political decision-making, and shared economic benefits, continued ties to the United Kingdom, and new ties to Ireland. The process that produced the pact began with the determination of John Major and Albert Reynolds to seek peace, continued when John Bruton succeeded Reynolds, and was completed by Bertie Ahern, Tony Blair, David Trimble, John Hume, and Jerry Adams. My first visa to Adams and the subsequent intense engagement at the White House made a difference, and George Mitchell handled the negotiations brilliantly. Of course, the main credit went to those who had to make the hard decisions, the Northern Irish leaders, Blair and Ahern, and to the people of Northern Ireland who had chosen to promise a peace over a poisoned past. The agreement would have to be ratified in a referendum by the voters of Northern Ireland and the Irish Republic on May 22nd. With a touch of Irish eloquence, it became known as the Good Friday Accord. At around that time, I also flew to the Johnson Space Center in Houston. What? The Space Center? You weren't talking about space medicine, were you? To discuss our newest shuttle mission to conduct 26 experiments on the impact of space on the human body, including how the brain adapts and what happens to the inner ear and the human balance system. One of the crew was in the audience, 77-year-old Senator John Glenn. You mean the man who requested the audit from the Office of the Comptroller of Currency regarding complaints regarding workers at uranium enrichment facilities? No, that John Glenn? That's Senator John Glenn? No way. What kinds of problems were people working at uranium enrichment facilities having at that time, Uncle Bill? After flying 149 combat missions in World War II in Korea, John had been one of America's first astronauts more than 35 years earlier. He was retiring from the Senate and was itching to go into space once more. NASA's director, Dan Golden, and I were strongly in favor of Glenn's participation because our space agency wanted to study the effects of space on aging. Get that? Sorry. Space on aging. I had always been a strong supporter of the space program, including the International Space Station and the upcoming mission to Mars. John Glenn's last hurrah gave us a chance to show the practical benefits of space exploration. I then flew to Chile for a state visit and the second summit of the Americas after the long, harsh dictatorship of General Augusto Pinochet, Chile seemed firmly committed to democracy under the leadership of President Eduardo Frei, whose father had also been president of Chile in the 1960s. Shortly after the summit, Mac McLarty resigned as my special envoy to the Americas. By then, my old friend had made more than 40 trips to the region in the 4 years since he had taken the job, and in so doing, had sent an unmistakable message. The United States was committed to being a good neighbor. Really? Well, that's really important. I've read this before, Uncle Bill. I've heard this story before. Thanks for sharing it. But, there's another story I want to hear today, too. Please, Uncle Bill, tell us that story again about the kiss. On September 9th, Yitzhak Rabin called to tell me that Israel and the PLO had reached a peace agreement. It was achieved in secret talks the parties held in Oslo, which we were informed of shortly before I took office. On a couple of occasions when the talks were in danger of being derailed, Warren Christopher had done a good job of keeping them on track. The talks were kept confidential, which enabled the negotiators to deal candidly with the most sensitive issues and agree on a set of principles that both sides could accept. Most of our work lay in the future, in helping with the immensely difficult task of resolving the tough issues, hammering out the terms of implementation, and raising the money to finance the cost of the agreement, from increased security for Israel to economic development and refugee relocation and compensation for the Palestinians. I had already gotten encouraging signs of financial support from other countries, including Saudi Arabia, where King Fahd, though still angry about Yasser Arafat's support for Iraq in the Gulf War, was supportive of the peace process. We were still a long way from a comprehensive solution, but the Declaration of Principles was a huge step forward. On September 10th, I announced that the Israeli and the Palestinian leaders would sign the agreement on the south lawn of the White House on Monday, the 13th, and that because the PLO had renounced violence and recognized Israel's right to exist, the United States would resume its dialogue with them. A couple of days before the signing, the press asked me if Arafat would be welcome at the White House. I said that it was up to the parties directly involved to decide who would represent them in the ceremony. In fact, I badly wanted Rabin and Arafat to attend and urged them to do so. If they didn't, no one in the region would believe they were fully committed to implementing the principles, and if they did, 1 billion people across the globe would see them on television, and they would leave the White House even more committed to peace than when they arrived. When Arafat said he would be there, I again asked Rabin to come. He accepted, though he was still a bit on edge about it. In retrospect, the leader's decision to come may look easy. At the time, it was a gamble for both Rabin and Arafat, who couldn't be sure how their people would react. Even if a majority of their constituents supported them, extremists on both sides were bound to be inflamed by the compromises on fundamental issues inherent in the Declaration of Principles. Rabin and Arafat showed both vision and guts in consenting to come and speak. The agreement would be signed by Foreign Ministers Shimon Peres and Mahmoud Abbas, better known as Abu Mazen, both of whom had been intimately involved in the Oslo negotiations. Secretary Christopher and Russian Foreign Minister Andrei Kozyerev would witness the accord. On the morning of the 13th, the atmosphere around the White House was alive with excitement as well as tension. We had invited more than 2,500 people to the event, which George Stephanopoulos and Rahm Emanuel had labored over. I was especially happy Rahm was working on this because he had served in the Israeli army. President Carter, who had negotiated the Camp David Accords between Egypt and Israel, would be there. So would President Bush, who, with Gorbachev, had co-sponsored talks in Madrid in 1991 involving Israel, the Palestinians, and the Arab states. President Ford was invited but couldn't get to Washington before the celebration dinner in the evening. All former secretaries of state and national security advisors who had worked for peace over the past 20 years were also invited. Chelsea was taking the morning off from school, as were the Gore children. This was something they didn't want to miss. The night before, I had gone to bed at 10 early for me and awakened at 3 in the morning. Unable to go back to sleep, I got my Bible and read the entire book of Joshua. It inspired me to rewrite some of my remarks and to wear a blue tie with golden horns, which reminded me of those Joshua had used to blow down the walls of Jericho. Now the horns would be herald the coming of a peace that would return Jericho to the Palestinians. We had 2 minor flaps in the morning. When I was told that Arafat intended to appear in his trademark garb, a keffiyeh and an olive green uniform, and that he might want to dress it up with a revolver he often wore on his hip, I balked and sent word that he couldn't bring the gun. He was here to make peace. A pistol would send the wrong message, and he certainly would be safe without it. He agreed to come unarmed. When the Palestinians saw that they were identified in the agreement as the Palestinian delegation, not the PLO, they balked. Israel agreed the preferred designation. Then there was the question of whether Rabin and Arafat would shake hands. I knew Arafat wanted to do it. Before arriving in Washington, Rabin had said he would do the handshake, quote, if it will be needed, end quote, but I could tell he didn't want to. When he arrived at the White House, I raised the subject. He avoided making a commitment, telling me how many young Israelis had been buried because of Arafat. I told Yitzhak that if he was really committed to peace, he'd have to shake Arafat's hand to prove it. Quote, the whole world will be watching and the handshake is what they will be looking for, end quote. Rabin sighed and in his deep, world-weary voice said, quote, I suppose one does not make peace with one's friends, end quote. Quote, then you'll do it, end quote, I asked. He almost snapped at me. Quote, all right, but no kissing, end quote. The traditional Arab greeting was a kiss on the cheek, and he wanted no part of that. I knew Arafat was a great showman and might try to kiss Rabin after the handshake. We decided that I would shake hands with each of them first and sort of motion them together. I was sure that if Arafat didn't kiss me, he wouldn't try kissing Rabin. As I stood in the Oval Office discussing it with Hillary, George Stephanopoulos, Tony Lake, and Martin Indyk, Tony said he knew a way I could shake hands with Arafat while avoiding a kiss. He described the procedure and we practiced it. I played Arafat and he played me, showing me what to do. When I shook his hand and moved in for the kiss, he put his left hand on my right arm where it was bent at the elbow and squeezed. It stopped me cold. Then we reversed roles and I did it to him. We practiced it a couple of more times until I felt sure Rabin's cheek would remain untouched. We all laughed about it, but I knew avoiding the kiss was deadly serious for Rabin. Just before the ceremony, all three delegations gathered in the large oval blue room on the main floor of the White House. The Israelis and the Palestinians still weren't talking to each other in public, so the Americans went back and forth between the two groups as they moved around the rim of the room. We looked like a bunch of awkward kids riding a slow-moving carousel. Mercifully, it was over before long, and we walked downstairs to start the ceremony. Everyone else walked out on cue, leaving Arafat, Rabin, and me alone for a moment. Arafat said hello to Rabin and held out his hand. Yitzhak's hands were firmly grasped behind his back. He said tersely, quote, outside, end quote. Arafat just smiled and nodded his understanding. Then Rabin said, quote, we are going to have to work very hard to make this work, end quote. Arafat replied, quote, I know, and I'm prepared to do my part, end quote. We walked out into the bright sunshine of a late summer day. I opened the ceremony with a brief welcome and words of thanks, support, and encouragement for the leaders in their determination to achieve a, quote, peace of the brave, end quote. Perez and Abbas followed me with brief speeches, then sat down to sign the agreement. Warren Christopher and Andrei Kozyrev witnessed it while Rabin, Arafat, and I stood behind and to the right. When the signing was completed, all eyes shifted to the leaders. Arafat stood on my left and Rabin to my right. I shook hands with Arafat with the blocking maneuver I had practiced. I then turned and shook hands with Rabin, after which I stepped back out of the space between them and spread my arms to bring them together. Arafat lifted his hand toward a reluctant Rabin. When Rabin extended his hand, the crowd let out an audible gasp, followed by thunderous applause as they completed the kissless handshake. All the world was cheering, except for die-hard protesters in the Middle East who were inciting violence, and demonstrators in the front of the White House claiming they were endangering Israel's security. I'm sorry, Uncle Bill. I said that wrong. We were endangering Israel's security. Wow, Uncle Bill, that is a very, very different way to say and to speak and to tell the story of a peace agreement involving the Irish than it is to speak about a peace agreement involving the Israelis and the Palestinians. Don't you think, Uncle Bill? Where's Paula Jones? There's no mention of Paula Jones in the story of the Oslo peace agreement. The only option of an assault weapon is the sidearm Arafat usually wears on his hip. I'm sorry, revolver, right? Well, it's an important day, Uncle Bill. But I'm thankful you told me the story again.